The situation surrounding Katie Bates and her husband Travis Clark has taken another emotional turn, as Travis continues to speak publicly about the damage caused by his affair and his determination to fight for his marriage and family. For fans who have followed Katie and Travis since their days connected to Bringing Up Bates, the past several months have been filled with painful and unexpected developments. What once appeared to be a young family building a future together suddenly became the center of a very public marriage crisis. In January 2026, Travis publicly admitted that he had been unfaithful to Katie and had repeatedly broken her trust. His confession came shortly after Katie revealed that she had experienced a pregnancy loss, making an already heartbreaking period even more difficult for the family. Travis acknowledged that his actions were his responsibility and said that he was deeply sorry for the pain and betrayal he had caused. But nearly 2 months later, Travis returned with another emotional message, making it clear that he was not simply walking away from the consequences of his choices. In a March 4th post, Travis reflected on what had happened and admitted that he had spent the previous couple of months thinking deeply about his actions. He described himself as disappointed, ashamed, and disgusted with himself over the decisions he had made. More importantly, Travis said that the months following his confession had been humbling and filled with difficult work, therapy, and time devoted to his faith. He also made a statement that immediately caught the attention of fans. Travis said that he knew he was not owed anything, but that he was desperately fighting for his wife and his family every single day. That statement revealed just how serious the situation had become. Rather than presenting himself as someone who expected immediate forgiveness, Travis appeared to recognize that rebuilding trust would take time and effort. His words suggested that he understood an apology alone could not erase the damage caused by his actions. And for Katie, the situation was never simply about a husband making a public apology. It was about trust. It was about the future of her family. And it was about trying to process an enormous amount of emotional pain while also being a mother to 2 young children. Katie later addressed the situation herself, explaining that her marriage had been deeply hurt and that her trust had been broken. She said she was taking life one day at a time and focusing on what mattered most to her, her children, their future, and her own healing. That response was significant because it showed that Katie was not rushing to provide the public with a simple answer about the future of her marriage. Instead, she was giving herself time. She was trying to heal. And she was making decisions based on what she believed was best for herself and her children. In the weeks that followed, Katie also spoke about getting professional support. She acknowledged that the situation was too difficult for her to handle completely on her own and discussed going through an intensive therapy experience. For fans, that became an important part of the story because it demonstrated that the aftermath of an affair was not something that could be solved with a single conversation or social media statement. There was a process. There was hurt. There were questions about whether trust could ever be rebuilt. And there was the much larger question of what Katie and Travis wanted their family to look like moving forward. Meanwhile, Travis' March statement showed that he understood he had a long road ahead of him. His decision to say that he was desperately fighting for his family was not presented as a guarantee that everything would immediately return to normal. Instead, it appeared to be a declaration that he intended to put in the work and accept the uncertainty that came with it. That distinction is important. When someone breaks trust in a marriage, saying sorry does not automatically restore the relationship. The person who is hurt has the right to decide what happens next, and rebuilding a marriage can require consistency, patience, accountability, and time. Travis appeared to recognize that reality when he said he was not owed anything. For Katie, the emotional stakes were especially high because the affair became public during an already devastating period in her life. Her pregnancy loss had already brought grief and sadness, and Travis' confession added another layer of pain to an incredibly difficult chapter. That combination made the situation even more complicated. Instead of being able to focus only on healing from one painful event, Katie suddenly had to navigate questions about her marriage, her family's future, and the public attention surrounding everything happening behind the scenes. And because Katie and Travis had shared so much of their relationship publicly over the years, fans naturally wanted to know what would happen next. Would they remain together? Could their marriage survive? Would Katie eventually forgive Travis? Or would the betrayal become a permanent turning point in their relationship? At that stage, none of those questions had an easy answer. What was clear, however, was that Travis was publicly taking responsibility for his actions while Katie was publicly prioritizing her healing. That difference in their positions made the situation especially emotional. Travis was talking about what he wanted to fight for. Katie was focusing on what she needed to recover. And both realities could exist at the same time. The story also raised an important point about forgiveness. Forgiveness, if it happens, does not necessarily mean forgetting what happened. It does not automatically mean that trust returns overnight. And it does not mean the person who was hurt has to make a decision simply because the other person is asking for another chance. For Katie and Travis, rebuilding anything would require more than words. It would require actions over time. And that is exactly why Travis' statement about fighting for his family became such a major moment in their story. He was essentially acknowledging that the future of his marriage could not be controlled by him alone. Katie would have a voice in that future. And after everything she had experienced, she needed the space to decide what healing and moving forward would look like for her. As fans watched the situation unfold, many were left wondering whether Travis' public commitment would eventually translate into lasting changes behind closed doors. Because saying that you are willing to fight is one thing. Proving it through everyday actions is another. And for a marriage damaged by infidelity, that difference can mean everything. The emotional story surrounding Katie Bates and Travis Clark continued to develop as the couple faced one of the most difficult periods of their relationship. After Travis publicly admitted to his affair, the question was no longer simply about what had happened. The bigger question became whether the trust that had been broken could ever be rebuilt. For Katie, this was not an ordinary relationship problem that could be solved with a quick apology. The betrayal happened during a period when she was already dealing with tremendous emotional pain, including the loss of a pregnancy. That made the situation even more complicated and deeply personal. As Travis reflected on his actions, he made it clear that he understood the seriousness of what he had done. His comments suggested that he was not trying to minimize the affair or shift responsibility onto anyone else. Instead, he appeared to be accepting the consequences. And that was especially important because accountability became one of the central themes of his public statements. Travis acknowledged that he had made choices that damaged the trust Katie had placed in him. He also recognized that Katie did not owe him immediate forgiveness simply because he was apologizing. That realization became particularly significant when he said he was desperately fighting for his family. The wording showed that Travis understood he could not demand a particular outcome. He could fight. He could change. He could seek help. He could become more accountable. But ultimately, Katie would have to decide whether she believed the relationship could move forward. For someone in Katie's position, rebuilding trust could be a long and exhausting process. Every promise would need to be backed up by action. Every commitment would need to be consistent. And every step forward could potentially bring back memories of what happened. That is one of the difficult realities of dealing with infidelity. The person who broke the trust may want to move forward quickly, but the person who is hurt may need much more time. Katie appeared to understand that she could not force herself to heal according to someone else's timeline. She needed to process what had happened in her own way. And she needed to think about her children and her future before making any major decisions. Her approach also showed that she was trying to protect her emotional well-being while navigating the enormous amount of public attention surrounding her marriage. For a reality television family, privacy can be extremely difficult. Fans have watched Katie grow up, fall in love, marry Travis, become a mother, and build a life with him. Because so much of that journey has been shared publicly, people naturally became emotionally invested in the couple. But the reality of their marriage existed beyond social media. There were conversations that fans would never see. There were emotions that could not be captured in a short video. And there were decisions that ultimately belonged to Katie and Travis alone. That is why Travis' declaration about fighting for his family did not necessarily mean that everything had been repaired. It meant that he was saying he wanted to repair it. Those are two very different things. A marriage can survive betrayal, but survival requires effort from both people. It also requires the person who caused the betrayal to understand why trust was destroyed in the first place. Travis appeared to be focusing heavily on that process. His willingness to seek therapy and work through his own behavior suggested that he understood the problem was deeper than simply apologizing for one mistake. An affair can involve a series of decisions, boundaries that were crossed, and patterns of behavior that eventually lead to a devastating discovery. Changing those patterns requires serious self-reflection. And that is why therapy became an important part of the conversation. For Travis, therapy could provide an opportunity to understand why he made the decisions he made and what he needed to change to prevent similar behavior in the future. For Katie, therapy could provide a safe place to process betrayal, grief, anger, disappointment, and uncertainty. The fact that both sides needed support highlighted how complicated their situation had become. At the same time, their family responsibilities did not disappear. Katie and Travis were still parents. They still had children who depended on them. They still had everyday responsibilities. And they still had to navigate life while dealing with a major personal crisis. That can make a relationship crisis even more challenging. There is no simple way to press pause on family life while deciding whether a marriage can be repaired. Parents still have to wake up, care for their children, handle responsibilities, and make decisions. And emotionally, they may be dealing with completely different feelings from one day to the next. One day, hope may feel possible. The next day, anger or sadness may return. For Katie, that emotional uncertainty could make the healing process unpredictable. And for Travis, his declaration that he was desperately fighting for his family meant that he needed to understand that patience would be essential. He could not expect one good week to erase months of pain. He could not expect one apology to restore years of trust. And he could not assume that Katie's decision would happen on his preferred timeline. Instead, he would have to continue demonstrating through his behavior that he was serious about changing. That is where the story became less about a dramatic public confession and more about what happened afterward. Because the aftermath of an affair can reveal far more than the confession itself. Anyone can make promises when a relationship is on the line. The real test comes months later, when the cameras are gone, the social media attention fades, and everyday life returns. Would Travis continue doing the difficult work? Would Katie begin to feel safe again? Could they eventually communicate without the betrayal dominating every conversation? Could they rebuild a relationship that looked different from the one they had before? Those were the questions hanging over their marriage. And fans were paying close attention. Some supporters encouraged Travis to keep fighting for his family. Others emphasized that Katie deserved the time and space necessary to make her own decision. There were also people who pointed out that reconciliation is never something that should be forced simply because a couple has children or because they have spent years together. The most important factor is whether the relationship can become healthy again. For Katie, that meant looking beyond the emotions of the moment. She had to consider whether she could eventually trust Travis again. She had to consider whether she could live without constantly questioning his actions. She had to consider what kind of environment would be healthiest for her children. And she had to consider what she wanted for herself. Those are enormous questions for anyone to face. Meanwhile, Travis' words suggested that he understood the seriousness of what was at stake. He was not simply fighting to protect his public image. At least according to his statements, he was fighting for his marriage and his family. That distinction mattered because the public had already learned about his betrayal. There was no way to completely undo that. The only thing he could control was what he did next. And that is where his commitment to change became so important. If his words were going to mean anything, they would have to be followed by consistent actions. Katie's healing also became an important reminder that surviving betrayal does not happen on a schedule. There is no exact number of days or months after which someone is supposed to feel better. For one person, healing may involve forgiveness. For another, it may involve separation. For someone else, it may involve trying to rebuild the marriage while still working through pain. Every situation is different. And Katie's situation was especially complicated because it unfolded in the public eye. Every statement could be analyzed. Every photograph could lead to speculation. Every social media post could cause fans to wonder whether the couple had reconciled or whether they were still struggling. That kind of attention can make an already difficult situation even harder. It also means that both Katie and Travis had to be careful about what they shared publicly. Their marriage was ultimately their personal life, even though millions of people knew their story. And while Travis was willing to say that he was desperately fighting for his family, Katie's response remained the part many people were waiting to understand. Would she eventually give the marriage another chance? Would she continue focusing on herself and her children? Would time change the way she felt about Travis? At that point, the future remained uncertain. But one thing was becoming increasingly clear. The story was no longer about one shocking confession. It was about the long road that followed. The road of accountability. The road of healing. The road of rebuilding trust. And possibly, the road toward a very different kind of marriage. Travis' declaration that he was fighting desperately for his family showed where he stood. But Katie's feelings and decisions would ultimately determine what came next. And that is what made the situation so emotional. Because even if Travis was willing to fight with everything he had, rebuilding a broken relationship requires more than one person's determination. It requires time. It requires honesty. It requires consistent change. And most importantly, it requires the person who is hurt to feel that moving forward is genuinely right for them. For Katie Bates and Travis Clark, that journey was still unfolding. And as the months continued, fans would be watching not just for another statement, but for evidence of what their future would actually look like.